Bloodborne is filled with people who vanished without a trace: hunters, scholars, patients, children, and I want to talk about every single one of them. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I made this video because the missing persons thread running through Bloodborne felt like the most underexplored corner of its lore. Most analyses focus on the great ones, the blood, the nightmare, and those are fascinating, but there's this whole other layer of ordinary people who simply stopped existing. And the game only gives you fragments of why. When I was assembling this, I made one specific choice that I think shapes everything you're about to hear. I deliberately excluded every disappearance that gets a clean resolution, even a partial one. If the game points you clearly toward an answer, I left it out. What remains is everything the game refuses to explain. That discipline is what made this list so unsettling to put together. These are the cases where Yharnam swallowed someone whole and left nothing but a name. Chapter 1. The Hunters Who Never Came Back. There is a list. Not a literal list you find in a drawer or on a notice board, but a list assembled from scraps. Weapon descriptions. Item pickups. Environmental placements. Bloodborne names its hunters, and then, in case after case, those named hunters are simply not present in the world anymore. The question of where they went turns out to be one of the most layered threads in the entire game, and it starts before the night of the hunt even begins. Gascoigne is the most visible example of a hunter coming apart, but he's the resolution, not the mystery. He's the case file with an ending. The hunters worth examining are the ones the game mentions and then offers nothing more. Henrik is one of the earliest. You find him wearing the same set of armour as Gascoigne, which already tells you they work together, and his item description notes that he has served as a hunter for a very long time. The phrasing is passive. It doesn't say he's still serving. It says he served. The use of past tense in these descriptions is never accidental in Bloodborne. When you encounter Henrik, he's hostile. That part is explained. Eileen needs you to put him down as part of her questline, but what isn't explained is what happened to him between his years of service and this moment. He clearly didn't die on the job. He's still walking, still capable of fighting. But he's not hunting anymore in any purposeful sense. He's adrift. The game never specifies what broke him or when. There's a version of Henrik's story that involves something he witnessed or something he did, and the game withholds it entirely. The hunter set you can obtain from the game, the standard set, the one associated with the workshop, comes with descriptions suggesting it's been passed down through generations of hunters. That means there are hunters before the hunters you know about. There is a lineage of people who entered the night, and who, presumably, did not all survive to retire peacefully. The workshop itself seems to understand this. The way it's constructed, the way it stores weapons and blood vials like a quartermaster's room, suggests preparation for attrition. People are expected to not come back. Old Yharnam is the most direct confrontation with this idea. The entire district was burned, supposedly to contain the beast scourge, and the people inside burned with it. But the game implies that many of the people inside Old Yharnam were not beasts when the fires started. They were in the process of transforming, or they were suspected of transforming, or they were simply in the wrong district at the wrong time. Hunters carried out that burning, hunters who have names in some of the item descriptions. None of those names correspond to people you can find in the game world. There's a figure referred to obliquely in certain item descriptions as one of the first hunters. Not the first. The cleric beast and the history of the church suggests a longer lineage, but among the first of the organised workshop hunters. This figure is associated with a specific weapon, and the weapon's description acknowledges that the figure eventually disappeared. Not died, disappeared. The game uses that word deliberately, and it uses it in contrast to hunters who are described as falling in battle or succumbing to beasthood. This one simply stopped being accounted for. The hunter's workshop is abandoned when you arrive in it. There's no one there. The plain doll is inert until you have insight. Ludwig's holy blade sits in a chest as though someone left it for safekeeping. The whole space has the feeling of a place that was bustling, and then very suddenly wasn't. The people who staffed it, who sharpened the blades and prepared the vials and trained the new recruits, where are they? The game never addresses this. It's possible they're among the beasts you fight in central Yharnam. It's possible they fled. It's possible something happened in the workshop itself that the game considers too settled to explain. A juror stands on a tower in Old Yharnam and will shoot at you on sight until you trigger his quest or sneak past him. He's clearly a veteran, his armour and weapons are old, his manner is weary, but the hunters who once worked with him are gone. He mentions them, or the game implies they existed, through the way he speaks about the past tense of hunting. He stayed. They didn't. Where they went is not something the game addresses directly. He doesn't mourn them in any dialogue you can access. He just stands there, alone, guarding people he can no longer communicate with. The connection between hunters and the old blood is something the game circles around constantly, without ever fully landing on. It's suggested that exposure to the old blood gradually changes the hunters who use it, not just physically but cognitively, perceptually. They start seeing things differently. Some of them, the game implies, start walking toward the things they see rather than away from them. A hunter who begins following those perceptions into the dark parts of the city does not, as a rule, come back. This is one of the most plausible explanations for the missing hunters the game catalogues. They went somewhere they couldn't return from, not because they were killed, but because they stopped wanting to return. The Healing Church employs hunters of its own distinct from the workshop hunters, and the relationship between those two groups is uneasy. Church hunters are described as having access to different weapons, different methods, different blood. When the church hunters started disappearing, the church apparently did not flag it as a crisis. The records, to the extent the game implies records were kept, seem to have been quietly managed. A hunter going missing from workshop roles might be noticed. A hunter going missing from church roles in a system run by the church itself might simply be reclassified. The choir is the upper echelon of the Healing Church, the people doing the most advanced research into the Great Ones and the Old Blood. The people in the choir had access to things other hunters didn't, and the game implies they used those things on themselves voluntarily. Several choir hunters are referenced in item descriptions with a phrasing that suggests they undertook a specific procedure and then were not heard from again. Whether that procedure worked or failed catastrophically is not resolved. The game presents their absence as a data point, not an answer. Ludwig is the closest thing to a missing hunter with a clear location, but the reasons for his specific deterioration remain genuinely murky. He's in the nightmare. He doesn't remember who he was. When he does briefly remember, the clarity only lasts a moment. What the game doesn't tell you is how he got from being the founder of the church hunter system to being what you find in the nightmare. There's a gap there, a period of his history that isn't reconstructible from the item descriptions and environment alone. People who knew Ludwig during that transition are also not present in the game world. The powder kegs are a faction of hunters who disagreed with the workshop's methods. The game establishes this through their weapon descriptions, which carry a note of defiance in them, a pride in non-standard approaches. The powder kegs, as a functioning group, are not present in the game. They are referenced as a historical faction. What happened to them is treated as settled history, but the game never actually tells you what that history was. They existed, they dissented, they're gone. The mechanism of their disappearance isn't supplied. When you read the weapon descriptions carefully, you start to notice that Bloodborne tracks its hunter populations through objects more than through people. A weapon passes from one hand to another. A set of armour is found in a location rather than worn by its original owner. The implicit story in these item transitions is that the previous owners stopped using them, which, in Yharnam, has a limited range of explanations. But occasionally the descriptions use language that doesn't map onto death or beasthood. They suggest the previous owner simply moved on, or moved away, or went somewhere else. Those are the cases the game never closes. The Hunter's Nightmare is in a sense a repository of hunters who went missing from the waking world. The nightmare traps people. It's possible, the game more than suggests it, that a number of the hunters who vanished from Yharnam's records are not dead, but are in the nightmare, experiencing it on a loop, unable to wake up. Simon the Harrowed is the clearest example of someone who entered the nightmare voluntarily, and then found that leaving was not straightforward. The hunters who preceded Simon, who entered the nightmare before it was as well documented as it becomes, presumably had even fewer tools for understanding what was happening to them. There are graves in Yharnam. The game doesn't make a big deal of them. But they're there. Grave markers in the cathedral district, in the gardens, scattered through areas that were once maintained and aren't anymore. Some of those graves presumably belong to hunters. The ones that don't have names inscribed, the ones that are just stones in the ground, are the most interesting. A hunter who died clearly and was buried clearly is a resolved case. A grave marker with no inscription or with a weathered, unreadable name is a missing persons case that somebody thought was closed and wasn't. The female hunters are particularly poorly represented in the game's explicit lore, which may be a deliberate design choice, or may reflect something about how the historical record in Yharnam was kept. Eileen is exceptional in being named and present. The item descriptions for female-coded hunter gear are sparse. Who wore this gear originally? What happened to them, whether they were part of the workshop or independent? The game doesn't say. Their absence from the lore record is its own kind of haunting. The doll's backstory is one of the most studied mysteries in the game, but what's underexamined is the question of the person she was modelled after. There was a real woman. The doll is a replica. The real woman is not present in the game world. Gehrman knows who the original was. He doesn't tell you. Whether the original woman disappeared in a way that connects to the broader pattern of missing hunters is one of the most tangled questions the game presents, and it doesn't supply even partial resolution. Gehrman himself is, in some readings, a kind of missing person, not in the physical sense, since he's very much present, but in the sense that whoever he was before the first hunter became the hunter's dream is not recoverable from what you meet. He's been in the dream so long that the person who entered it is not the person sitting in the wheelchair. What happened to that earlier version of Gehrman is something the game treats as irrelevant. But if you're tracking missing hunters, the pre-Nightmare Gehrman is one of the most significant gaps. There's a theory, supported by certain item descriptions and environmental details, that the hunters who disappeared from Yharnam streets during particularly bad nights of the hunt were not all killed by beasts or by each other. Some of them, the theory goes, were collected. The nature of what collected them is where the readings diverge. The Great Ones are one candidate. The Choir's experiments are another. A third reading suggests that the dream itself, the mechanism Gehrman uses to run the hunt, occasionally pulls in people who weren't intended for it. Hunters who weren't given the blood sacrament, but who got caught in the nightmare's radius during a night when the barrier between the dream and the waking world was thinner than usual. The hunter's mark is an item you use to return to the dream. Its description suggests it's connected to a covenant, a relationship between the hunter and the dream. But the game implies that the mark can be imposed rather than chosen, that people can be marked without consenting to the process. A hunter who gets marked without understanding what it means is a hunter who is now functionally linked to a system they don't understand, and that system does not guarantee return. The marked hunters who didn't know what the mark meant are, in the game's implied history, some of the most cleanly disappeared. The way Bloodborne handles time in the hunter's dream makes the question of missing hunters genuinely difficult to resolve, even in principle. Time in the dream doesn't correspond to time in Yharnam. A hunter could spend what feels like years in the dream, while a single night passes in the city. This means that hunters who seem to have vanished from Yharnam's records might not be dead or transformed. They might simply be experiencing a different timescale. They're missing from the city's perspective. From their own perspective, they might be in the middle of a hunt right now. The insight mechanic, the way gaining insight changes your perception of the world, is connected to several of the missing hunter cases in ways the game never makes fully explicit. It's implied that hunters who accumulate too much insight start perceiving things that other people can't see, and it's implied that those perceptions, over time, become more compelling than ordinary reality. A hunter who has seen through the veil enough times, who has killed enough eldritch things and absorbed enough of what those things left behind. That hunter has a relationship with ordinary Yharnam that is increasingly tenuous. The ones who reached a certain threshold and then stopped appearing in the records might not have gone anywhere. They might just have stopped existing in a form that the records could track. The interconnection between the missing hunters and the people who tried to find them is its own layer, because some hunters did go looking for their colleagues, and some of those searchers also disappeared. The game implies this through dialogue from Eileen, who has been tracking hunters going mad for long enough that she has a methodology. She doesn't talk about all the hunters she's tracked, only the ones in front of you, in the current night. The ones she tracked before, the ones from previous hunts, are not accounted for. There is a place in the game, accessible only through a very specific sequence of events, that appears to function as a holding space of some kind. Whether it holds hunters or something else is not explicitly resolved. But the environmental design of that space, the way objects are arranged, the way the architecture suggests habitation rather than storage, points toward people having been in that space at some point and not being in it anymore. What moved them out of it, or whether something in it moved them somewhere else, is one of the cleanest, unsolved cases the game presents. The church's records of the hunt, the implied bureaucratic apparatus of a religious institution managing a blood medicine industry while also running a cadre of monster hunters, would, if they existed in a readable form, presumably contain a significant number of entries that simply trail off. Name, date of service commencement, and then nothing. The church's interest in maintaining those records cleanly would also be minimal. An institution that has something to hide about why its hunters keep disappearing would not be strongly motivated to document the disappearances clearly. The duality of the hunt, the way it's framed publicly as a charitable service and privately as a mechanism for controlling knowledge about the old blood, means that hunters who discovered the private reality of the hunt would become liabilities. The game implies this through the backstory of certain characters and the lore of certain areas. A hunter who learnt too much and then disappeared is a different kind of missing person than a hunter who went mad and got burned with Old Yharnam. Both are missing. Only one is missing because of what they knew. There is an NPC in the game, unnamed, encountered only briefly, who implies that they have been waiting in their location for someone who was supposed to come back and hasn't. The person they're waiting for is described in terms that suggest a hunter. How long they've been waiting is not established. Whether the person they're waiting for is in the nightmare, or dead, or transformed, or simply elsewhere, is not resolved. The NPC just waits. The game doesn't return to them. That unresolved wait is the most honest encapsulation of what Bloodborne does with its missing hunters. It acknowledges them through the people left behind, without ever answering the question those people are silently asking. The Vile Blood faction adds another dimension to the missing hunter question. The Vile Bloods of Cainhurst were apparently hunted by church hunters in a purge. The survivors, if there are any, are not confirmed present in the game world. Annalise persists in some form, but the other Vile Bloods, the ones who were in Cainhurst when the church hunters came, are treated as simply gone. The game doesn't provide casualty lists or survivors. It provides a castle full of ghosts, and a queen in a room, and the silence of a population that was erased. The Lake District has a specific concentration of missing persons cases that the game clusters without connecting. The fishing hamlet is full of people, or things that were people, who have undergone a transformation the game implies was not chosen. The people from the mainland who came to the hamlet and didn't leave. The hunters who were sent to investigate and didn't report back. The choir members who travelled to the coast for reasons documented only in the vaguest item descriptions. All of them are in a category the game marks as gone and refuses to elaborate on. The unseen village, the back half of Yharnam that most players access through the sewers, has its own cluster of implied absences. The houses are occupied by people who are becoming something else, but the houses also have the feel of places recently abandoned by a different population. People who lived in those houses before the current occupants. People who left in a hurry or were removed or went somewhere voluntarily are implied by the domestic arrangements inside. Furniture in the wrong positions. Belongings left behind. A house evacuated is a house with missing people. The relationship between the Grand Cathedral and the people who prayed in it, who lived near it, who served its functions before the hunt became the defining activity of the city. Those people are absent from the game world in a way that goes beyond the obvious explanation of beasthood. The Cathedral District is not purely overrun. Parts of it are maintained. Parts of it look like someone is still cleaning and arranging. The people doing that maintenance are not visible. Either they're inside structures you can't access, or they've become something unrecognizable, or they're simply not there anymore, and the maintenance is a habit the space hasn't shed yet. There is a school, Byrgenwerth, that produced the scholars who eventually became the leadership of the Healing Church. The school is not operational during the game. The students are gone. The professors are gone. Master Willem is there, in a wheelchair, having done something to himself that has made speech impossible. The school's population, which must have been significant given the size of the building and the implication of active research, is not present and not accounted for. Some of them presumably became the founding generation of the church. The rest, the ones who didn't make that transition, the students who were mid-study when the school collapsed, the faculty who disagreed with the direction, are simply not in the game world, and the game never addresses where they went. The Forbidden Woods functions as a place people entered and didn't leave, but the specific people, the ones before the snake-infested nightmare the space has become, are not well documented. The game implies the woods were used as a disposal site of some kind, a place the church sent things it didn't want in the city. If people were among the things sent there, which certain item readings suggest, those people are among the missing in the most clinical possible sense, removed from the record and filed under a location that the record keepers never had to revisit. The orphanage in the Upper Cathedral area is one of the most direct missing persons cases in the game, and it will get its own full treatment later in this video. But in the context of the missing hunters, it's worth noting that hunters were involved in the orphanage, at minimum as enforcers, possibly as subjects. The ones who serve that function and who are not present in the game world, not as enemies, not as corpses, not as ghosts, are a specific subcategory of missing that the game is particularly careful to leave unresolved. There's a reading of the doll that suggests she has met hunters before the hunter you play as. But the workshop has cycled through multiple hunters, each going through the same arc of awakening and progression and final confrontation with Gehrman. If that reading is correct, then all the previous hunters, the ones who preceded you in the dream, are also missing. They completed their arc and then went somewhere. The good ending sends your hunter into the dawn as a Great One lava. The Gehrman ending kills your hunter in the waking world. The true ending is even more ambiguous. If each previous hunter's cycle ended differently, then there are multiple types of missing hunters in the dream's history alone, each one unaccounted for in a different way. The story of the hunter who found Kos, or who was present at the fishing hamlet during whatever happened there, is told only in fragments. The implication is that a group of hunters, Gehrman among them possibly, went to the hamlet for the choir's research purposes, and that the experience destroyed or transformed them in ways that have never been fully documented. The hunters who came back from that trip are present in the game in altered states. The hunters who didn't come back, or who came back in a form that couldn't be reintegrated into the workshop or the church, are missing in the way that the fishing hamlet's history is missing, through enforced silence. The fact that the game begins with your hunter waking up in a clinic rather than in the workshop, waking up disoriented mid-process in a place that immediately tries to kill you, suggests that the standard onboarding for hunters has broken down by the time you arrive. There were presumably hunters who woke up in that clinic before you. There were presumably hunters who were processed through that clinic in a more organised way when the system was functioning. Those hunters, the ones who went through the clinic properly, are not present. The clinic is abandoned except for patients who have transformed. The staff who ran it, the people who administered the blood, who managed the new hunter's transition, are gone. The blood minister, who gives you your first blood transfusion, is, depending on how you read the ending sequence, possibly Gehrman, possibly the moon presence, possibly just a functionary. But regardless of what he is, the question of who did this job before him, who the blood ministers were in the earlier years of the hunt when the system was newly established, is interesting. Those people would have had significant exposure to both the old blood and the new hunters. They would have been in a position to know things that the church would not want widely known. And they are, without exception, not present in the game's world. The missing hunters, taken together, sketch a picture of a system that has been consuming its own operators for longer than anyone in the current generation of the hunt is willing to acknowledge. The church runs hunters. The church's hunters go missing. The church's institutional response to this pattern is not documentation or reform, it's the continued production of new hunters. It's a pipeline that doesn't ask where the output goes, because the institution's priorities don't require that question to be answered. The missing hunters are, in this reading, not a mystery the church failed to solve. They're a cost the church decided not to audit. Chapter 2, The Scholars of Byrgenwerth and the Students Who Disappeared Byrgenwerth, is presented as the origin point of everything terrible in Bloodborne. The research conducted there, the discovery of the old labyrinth, the exposure to Great One biology, the development of blood healing, generated the healing church, the scourge, and the nightmare. But Byrgenwerth as a functioning institution is not something the game shows you. By the time you arrive, it's a ruin with one occupant. The history of the school, including the history of its students, has to be reconstructed entirely from fragments. The school had a significant student population at some point. Byrgenwerth is a large building with multiple study areas, a lake-facing garden, a reading room, dormitories implied by the scale of the space. The research hall in the nightmare gives you a distorted version of what a Byrgenwerth facility looked like when operational, and it suggests a large number of researchers working simultaneously. That population is not accounted for in the waking world. Where did all of Byrgenwerth's scholars go? The simplest answer is that they became the founding generation of the healing church. The schism between Master Willem and Lawrence is well documented in the game's lore as the point where the institution split. Lawrence took some of the scholars with him. They became bishops, scholars of the church, members of the choir. But the game's implication is that not everyone followed Lawrence, and not everyone stayed with Willem. Some of the students were mid-study when the schism happened. Some of them had their own ideas about what the research should be used for. Those students, the ones who were neither Lawrence's people nor Willem's loyalists, are not in the game world. Master Willem is one of the most significant presences in the game, despite being almost entirely non-functional by the time you reach him. He's been in the chair for an unknown length of time. He gestures at the lake. He doesn't speak. The students who once studied under him, who attended his lectures, who conducted research under his supervision, who debated philosophy in the garden, are absent. Some of them presumably died of old age in the years since Bergenworth closed. But old age doesn't account for all of them, given that the blood healing discovered at Bergenworth has apparent longevity effects. A student who started at Bergenworth when the old blood was first discovered and who used the blood regularly might still be alive during the events of the game. Where that person is not addressed. The item descriptions connected to Bergenworth occasionally reference specific research projects, attempts to develop the eyes of a blood-drunk hunter into something useful, experiments with insight as a measurable quantity, methods for communing with the Great Ones through deliberate accumulation of knowledge. The researchers assigned to those projects are named only by role or by the description of their work, never by name. What happened to those specific researchers when their projects concluded or were abandoned is not supplied. A researcher who was in the middle of an insight accumulation experiment when the school closed would be in an unusual cognitive state. Where that person went, what they saw, what they became, is a gap the game preserves carefully. The lake itself is implied to be connected to a Great One presence. Murgo's wet nurse, the research into Kos, the moon, the lake at Bergenworth, sits at the centre of a web of Great One-related research that was being conducted there before anyone fully understood what they were working with. Students who were near the lake when certain experiments were conducted would have been exposed to things that the game suggests have transformative effects on human cognition and biology. The students who were closest to the lake research are also, not coincidentally, the ones most absent from the game world. The connection is implied, but never confirmed. There's a specific group of students referenced obliquely in one of the item descriptions as having gone into the old labyrinth beneath Yharnam in a research capacity and having not returned. This is presented as a historical data point rather than an active mystery. The institution of Bergenworth apparently processed the loss of those students as an acceptable research cost. Master Willem's response, if he had one, is not recorded. The students who went down and didn't come back are treated as a closed file, which is a very specific kind of institutional violence that the game makes legible without commenting on. The choir, which is the upper stratum of the healing church that has the most direct line back to Bergenworth's research, clearly absorbed some of the most talented Bergenworth students. But the choir's own missing members are a separate category. Choir members who are conducting particularly advanced experiments on themselves, on patients, on Great One material, and who then disappeared are documented through the choir-related item descriptions with a consistent pattern. The member undertook a procedure. And then there are no further records. Whether the procedure was successful and the member simply ascended beyond the reach of ordinary record-keeping, or whether the procedure failed catastrophically and the member was quietly removed from the rolls, is deliberately ambiguous. The research hall in the Hunter's Nightmare contains patients. The patients are in various stages of a transformation that has to do with eyes and insight and the desire to see more than human perception allows. The research hall is the choir's facility, but its architecture and methods are clearly descended from Bergenworth. The patients in the nightmare version of the research hall, the ones who clawed out their own eyes, the ones who are partially transformed into something echinoderm adjacent, were presumably living people at some point, people who came to the Healing Church's facilities for treatment. Where those people came from, who they were before, is something the game doesn't address. They're missing in the most complete sense, not just absent from the record, but absent from themselves. Lady Maria is one of the game's most significant examples of a person who was at Bergenworth or in its immediate orbit, and who then disappeared from the accessible lore. She's in the nightmare. She's a Canehurst noble who became a hunter, who worked alongside Gehrman, who apparently participated in whatever happened at the fishing hamlet. The specifics of her transition from Bergenworth-adjacent hunter to fixed point in the nightmare are not fully reconstructible. The Maria-shaped gap in the game's history, the space between her active participation in the hunt and her current state, is one of the most studied mysteries in the fandom, and it remains genuinely open. There's an implied relationship between Bögenwerth's approach to knowledge, keep it contained, controlled, elevated, above the masses, and the specific way in which Bögenwerth's students went missing. Willem's philosophy was that eyes on the inside, the accumulation of insight, was the path. The students who followed that path most faithfully are also the students most completely absent from the game world. The ones who accumulated enough insight to genuinely change their perception of reality are presumably somewhere, experiencing something, but that somewhere is not accessible through the game's geography. They're missing from the map, because the map doesn't extend to where they went. The pebble throwing that Willem does, gesturing toward the lake, is one of the game's most debated images. Some readings suggest he's indicating where the answers are. Some suggest he's demonstrating the futility of the research. Some suggest he's communicating with something in the lake. What all the readings share is the acknowledgement that Willem knows something that he cannot or will not communicate clearly. And that knowledge is connected to the disappearance of Bögenwerth's population. He watched his students leave, or change, or be taken, and whatever he saw in that process rendered him non-verbal and chair-bound. The most haunting reading of Willem is not that he survived, it's that surviving was the punishment. The schism between Willem and Lawrence is documented through Lawrence's skull, which you can find in the cathedral ward, and through the chalice dungeon items that reference their relationship. But the students who chose neither path, who rejected Lawrence's blood sacrament and rejected Willem's ascetic insight accumulation, are not documented at all. There were presumably students who looked at both options and said no. What happened to those students, whether they fled Yharnam or tried to live quietly within it, or were eventually caught by one system or another, is not in the game. The doll's implied origin at Bögenwerth, or at least in Gehrman's life during the Bögenwerth period, means that there are people from that era whose relationship to Gehrman and to the dream might help explain several of the missing cases. But those people are not available to interview. They're either dead, transformed, in the nightmare, or simply absent in a way the game declines to characterize. The Bögenwerth era is the game's founding trauma, and founding traumas in Bloodborne are not explicated, they're implied through absence. The research hall's location in the nightmare, the fact that it exists there rather than in the waking world, is itself a kind of disappearance. The hall was presumably a physical place at some point, or its contents were in a physical place. Something moved it into the nightmare, or something connected to the nightmare claimed it. The researchers who were inside when that happened, if they were inside, went into the nightmare with it. They're not dead. They're in a location that most people in the waking world cannot access. They're the most literally missing people in the game, geographically unreachable, without the nightmare's specific entrance conditions. The fishing hamlet's connection to Bögenwerth is one of the most significant implied relationships in the game. The hamlet has the secret that the choir and Bögenwerth were both pursuing. The people of the hamlet, the ancestors of the scholars, according to some item readings, or the source material for the blood healing research, are partially transformed by the time you reach them. The Bögenwerth scholars who went to the hamlet in the research phase, who were there when the most significant discoveries were made, are not in the hamlet when you arrive. They're not in Bögenwerth either. They're in the category of people who encountered the hamlet's secret and then ceased to appear in either location's records. The tension between Bögenwerth's secrecy and the healing church's more expansive ambitions created a conflict that the game implies was eventually resolved in the church's favour. But the resolution of that conflict, whatever it involved, is not documented in the game's accessible lore. The Bögenwerth scholars who were most resistant to the church's expansion, who tried to maintain the school's independence, are not in the game world. If they were removed by the church, by circumstance, by their own research, the mechanism of their removal is one of the gaps the game is most careful to preserve. There's a reading of certain Bögenwerth item descriptions that suggests the school had developed a method for storing consciousness outside of the body, a precursor to the techniques that eventually became the nightmare. If that reading is correct, then some of the missing Bergenworth scholars are not missing in the biological sense. They're stored somewhere. Their bodies might have decomposed or transformed, while their consciousness is preserved in some configuration the game doesn't show you directly. This is speculative, but the items that point toward it are consistent enough that it represents one of the more coherent explanations for the most completely absent members of the Bergenworth community. The connection between Bergenworth and the Thumerian civilization, the ancient people who built the old labyrinth and who had a different relationship with the Great Ones, adds a temporal dimension to the missing scholars question. Scholars who went into the labyrinth didn't just go underground. They went into contact with the remnants of a civilization that had its own methods for interacting with Great One adjacent forces, and those methods are not fully compatible with human biology as the Bergenworth scholars understood it. A scholar who spent enough time in the labyrinth, who absorbed enough of what the labyrinth contained, would not come back unchanged. The ones who didn't come back at all are presumably somewhere in the labyrinth, which has its own relationship with time and space that makes the concept of missing particularly complicated. The reading rooms of Bergenworth, the shelves and shelves of implied texts, the research notes and philosophical treatises that the game suggests the school produced, are not in any readable form when you arrive. The knowledge is missing. The texts are gone. This is itself a disappearance, not of people, but of the record of what people knew. A school that produces research and then has all of its research removed or destroyed is a school where the people have also effectively disappeared, because the only trace that would distinguish them from the undifferentiated mass of historical Yharnam is the work they did, and the work is gone. The involvement of women in Bergenworth's research is another gap. Lady Maria is the only named female character with a clear Bergenworth connection, and she's in the nightmare. If the school had female students, which the game doesn't confirm or deny, they're absent from the record in a way that goes beyond the general absence of Bergenworth personnel. The specific invisibility of women in Bergenworth's history mirrors the broader pattern in Yharnam's records. The institutions keep track of certain kinds of people and not others, and the ones not tracked are also the ones most completely missing from the game's accessible lore. The transition of certain Bergenworth scholars into the upper ranks of the Healing Church did not necessarily preserve their identity. A scholar who joined the choir and underwent the choir's procedures might have changed enough that the connection to their Bergenworth self is not obviously apparent. In this sense, the choir members who underwent the most radical procedures are also Bergenworth alumni who disappeared, not by leaving, but by becoming something sufficiently different that the original person is functionally absent. The game treats this as transformation rather than disappearance, but the distinction is worth questioning. The garden at Bergenworth, the outdoor space that overlooks the lake, has a tranquility to it that stands in sharp contrast to the nightmare of what happened inside the school. Flowers grow. The architecture is maintained in a way that suggests the natural processes of growth and decay, rather than active destruction. But the students who presumably sat in that garden, who discussed research and philosophy and the implications of what they were finding in the labyrinth, those students are gone. The garden persists without them. The tranquility of the garden is the tranquility of a space that has been emptied rather than damaged. The water flowing into the lake at Bergenworth is connected, in certain item readings, to the Great One's presence there. If the lake is a point of contact, a place where the membrane between the waking world and the nightmare is thin, then students who spent time near the lake were in a zone of elevated risk. Exposure to that zone over a long academic career would produce effects that the game implies are irreversible. The students who spent the most time near the lake, who were assigned to lake-related research, who found the lake particularly compelling for reasons they couldn't articulate, those students are, in this reading, the ones who ended up somewhere other than Yharnam. The lake took them, in the most literal possible sense of that phrase. Chapter 3. The Children of Iosefka's Clinic. The clinics of Yharnam, Iosefkas in central Yharnam, the research hall facility and the nightmare, are the places where the official relationship between the healing church and the city's population was supposed to be mediated. Blood healing happened at clinics. People came to clinics when they were sick, or when they wanted access to the old blood's benefits, or when the church directed them there. What happened to the people who entered the clinics and didn't emerge is one of the game's most methodically horrifying threads. Iosefka's clinic is where your hunter wakes up at the beginning of the game. The front entrance is locked immediately after you leave it. The building is large, significantly larger than any normal medical practice would require. The upper floors are not accessible through normal means during most of the game. What's happening on those upper floors is not immediately apparent, but by the time you understand it, the implications for the people who passed through Iosefka's clinic before you arrived are very dark. The real Iosefka, the woman who originally ran the clinic, is either dead or has been replaced by the time you encounter the clinic's occupant. The person speaking to you from behind the locked door sounds like a doctor, but the doctor's attitude toward her patients evolves across the game in a direction that is not consistent with the kind of care she initially presents. By the endgame, it's clear that people who were sent to Iosefka's clinic for refuge were being used for something. The question of where those people are, what happened to the ones who arrived and went upstairs and didn't come back down, is answered in a way that removes the people without explaining the process. The transformation that happens to clinic patients is connected to the choir's research into the celestial emissary. The patients become celestial beings, or they become something the game classifies as celestial in a way that is clearly not the transcendence the church would present it as. They're transformed into something non-human, and the transformation is not reversible, and the people who are those patients are, in the fullest sense, gone. Their bodies continue in a different form. The people who inhabited those bodies are missing. The children in Yharnam are a category the game handles carefully. The orphans of Iosefka, not named in the game, but implied through the orphanage connection and the clinic's proximity to certain districts, are children who were in the system of Yharnam's charitable institutions and who ended up in places they shouldn't have been. The game doesn't linger on this, it doesn't dwell on it. But the implication is present in the item descriptions and in the architecture of the spaces involved. The Upper Cathedral Ward Orphanage is the most direct confrontation with what happened to Yharnam's children. The orphanage is closed. The children are gone. The creatures in the Upper Cathedral area are what the game leaves in their place, which doesn't mean the children became those creatures, but the spatial relationship is suggestive. An institution that housed children sits in a location that now houses something terrible. The children who were in that institution are not present in the game world. The specific experiment that the orphanage children were used for, the attempt to create a surrogate for Kos's orphan, to produce a Iosefka-adjacent celestial being using children as substrate, is implied through the connection between the orphanage, the choir, and the celestial emissary boss. The game doesn't present this explicitly. It gives you the choir's interest in transcendence, the orphanage's connection to the church, and the celestial emissary's appearance, and leaves you to connect them. But connected, they form one of the most disturbing missing persons cases in the entire game. The children of Yharnam who weren't in the orphanage, who lived with families in the city during the events of the hunt, are absent from the game world in a way that is different from the adults. Most Yharnam residents you encounter are transformed or hostile. Children are simply not present. The game doesn't show you a single child in the streets, in the windows, in the crowds of transformed citizens. The absence is conspicuous enough that it reads as deliberate. Either the children were evacuated before the hunt night began, which the church's behaviour makes implausible, or they were somewhere specific, or something happened to them that the game declines to represent directly. The Healing Church's interest in children is connected to the same interest that drives the orphanage experiment. Children are more neurologically plastic, more susceptible to the changes that the old blood produces, more capable of the kind of insight accumulation that the church's upper tiers are pursuing. A child given access to old blood early enough might develop in a direction that an adult recipient never could. The church's charitable management of orphans in Yharnam is, in this reading, not charity at all. It's a pipeline, and the children in the pipeline are missing in the most deliberate possible way. The wet nurse, the creature guarding Murgo in the nightmare, is one of the most evocative images in the game, and its name alone carries a weight that connects to the questions about Yharnam's children. A wet nurse is someone who cares for infants. The Murgo's wet nurse is not caring for an infant in any conventional sense. But the naming suggests a history, a caring function that has been perverted or absorbed into something nightmarish. The human nurses, the caregivers who worked in Yharnam's charitable institutions, the women who worked in the clinics, they are absent from the game world in exactly the way the children they cared for are absent. The clinic in the nightmare, the research hall, has patient beds. The patients in those beds are in stages of transformation that the game presents with clinical coldness, numbered, arranged, expected. Someone placed these people in these beds. Someone designed the progression of the experiment. The administrators who ran the research hall, who made the decisions about which patients went into which beds and what was done to them, are not in the nightmare when you arrive. They're not in the waking world either. The administrators are missing from a crime scene of their own construction. The Celestial Emissary boss fight resolves the immediate mystery of what happened to at least some of the people in the upper cathedral area. But resolution in the form of a boss fight is not the same as an explanation. The boss fight tells you what is there now. It doesn't tell you who those beings were before, what their names were, whether any of them had family members still alive in the city who have been wondering for weeks or months what happened to their relative who went to the church clinic, the people who sent their family members to the church's institutions, the residents of Yharnam who trusted the healing church to care for their sick relatives or to take in their orphan children or to provide for people who couldn't provide for themselves, are in the game world. They're in the houses. They're among the transformed citizens. They don't know what happened to the people they sent to the church. They can't know, because the church is not in the business of sending explanatory letters to the families of experimental subjects. The missing people of Yharnam's charitable institutions are missing from the people who loved them, as well as from the records. The three women who appear in the game in a similar ecstatic ascended state, associated with the healing church's upper hierarchy, are examples of what the church's preferred transformation outcome looks like when it partially succeeds. They're serene, they're illuminated, they're not entirely human anymore. The women who became these figures had names once. They had lives before they entered the church's institutions. The game doesn't supply those names or those lives. It supplies the aftermath of a process, and leaves the people who underwent the process as anonymous as the orphans. The blood dregs mechanic, the accumulation of something in the blood of hunters who kill other hunters, is connected, in certain item readings, to the vile blood and Canehurst law. But the broader implication of blood dregs is that the blood itself carries traces of the people who used it. If the blood healing involves the blood of previous patients, if the transfusion system circulates blood through multiple recipients, then the patients who were the original sources of the blood are in a specific kind of limbo. Their blood is still active in the world. Their names and identities are not. They're missing in a way that's precisely the inverse of the orphanage children. They're present in the most material sense as biological substance in active circulation, while being completely absent as persons. The Pumerians, the ancient civilization whose ruins underlie Yharnam, had their own relationship with children and succession that the game implies was connected to the Great Ones. The Pumerian queens, the Chalice dungeon royalty, the remnants of a civilization that had figured out how to approach the Great Ones while remaining human enough to function. They're all missing in the sense that the civilization is gone. But children in the Pumerian context are specifically interesting, because the Chalice dungeons contain spaces that appear designed for children, smaller chambers, different furniture, alcoves that are sized for a person of small stature. What those spaces were used for is not explained. Who the small-statured occupants were is not named. Yharnam has a class system that the game makes legible through architecture and item quality. The poor districts, central Yharnam, the areas adjacent to the sewers, are different from the wealthy districts near the cathedral. The poor district's children are different from the cathedral ward's children in terms of how they were treated by the church's institutions. A child from a poor family in central Yharnam who was sent to the church's orphanage would have been processed differently than a child from a healing church family. The game doesn't make this explicit, but the architecture implies it. The missing children of Yharnam's poor districts are missing in a way that the institutions that took them were designed to make permanent. The connection between the clinic and the workshop, between Iosefka's institutional blood management and German's hunter management, is not explored in detail by the game. But they're operating in the same city during the same night, and they have overlapping interests. Hunters who were injured in the hunt were presumably directed to clinics. Clinics that were being run as experimental facilities would process injured hunters differently than a normal medical facility would. The hunters who went to Iosefka's clinic, wounded, and didn't emerge as hunters again, the ones who were redirected into the experimental pipeline, are a category of missing that combines two of the game's most significant institutions. The locked door in Iosefka's clinic is one of the game's most significant, inaccessible spaces. You can hear someone behind it. You can speak to her. You can send refugees to her. But you can't go in. The space behind that door, which the game eventually does allow you to access from another direction, contains the evidence of what's been happening there. But the evidence you find is the outcome evidence. The process evidence, what specifically was done to each of the people who came through, in what order, over what period of time, is not present. The missing persons in Iosefka's clinic are missing from their own case files. The refugee NPCs who go to Iosefka's clinic, at your suggestion, are some of the game's saddest disappearances. Because they're disappearances you participate in. You send them there. You tell them it's safe. The game's implication is that it's not safe, that you've sent them somewhere they won't be treated as patients. When you eventually reach the upper floors, you find evidence consistent with that implication. The refugees you sent are in a category of missing persons where you are, depending on how you read your own agency in the game, potentially one of the responsible parties. The pattern across Iosefka's clinic, the transformation of patients into experimental subjects, the absence of records, the locked space, the doctor who is not who she presents as, reproduces itself in every institution the game shows you. The clinic is the small-scale version of what the church does at every level of its operation. People enter. People don't leave. The explanations given for their departure are not accurate. The actual reasons for their disappearance are managed through institutional opacity. Bloodborne's missing persons are, at scale, a critique of an institution that converts human beings into research material and then manages the records so that the conversion is invisible. Chapter 4. The Cainhurst bloodline and the vanished noble's Cainhurst castle sits at the edge of the game's accessible world, reached only by a summons and a carriage ride through a snowstorm that seems to exist outside of normal Yharnam weather patterns. The castle is enormous. It is also empty. Not empty in the way a building gets empty when people leave. Empty in the way a building gets when everyone who was in it was specifically and deliberately removed. The Cainhurst bloodline was purged. The game tells you this plainly through the item descriptions and through Annalise herself, but the specifics of who was purged, where they went, whether any of them escaped, those specifics are not supplied. The Vilebloods are framed by the healing church as something between heretics and monsters. They fed on the blood of human beings, the church says. They were corrupted by a queen whose bloodline was tainted, the church says. The church's account of Cainhurst is not a neutral account, and the game gives you enough information to understand that the church's relationship with Cainhurst was more complicated than a simple purge of dangerous aristocrats. But the church's account is also the dominant account, because the people who could offer a counter-narrative, the Cainhurst nobles themselves, are not present in the game world. Annalise sits in her throne room in a state that seems to be somewhere between death and undeath. She's there, she speaks, she offers you a covenant, but she's isolated in a way that suggests her survival was not the intended outcome of the church hunters' visit to Cainhurst. The church hunters who carried out the purge are among the game's most referenced but least explained figures, named in the item descriptions of specific weapons as the people who executed the purge. Those hunters are not in the game world. They completed their mission, they left. Where they went after Cainhurst is not addressed. Alfred is the most enthusiastic Cainhurst hater in the game, and his reasons are personal in a way that the game doesn't fully explain. He follows Logarius's teachings. Logarius himself is one of the most significant missing adjacent figures in the game. A hunter who came to Cainhurst, who fought the Vilebloods, who then stayed, not as a resident, but as a sentinel, sitting in an impossible position on the castle's roof for an apparently endless period of time. Why Logarius stayed instead of leaving with the other hunters is not explained. What he saw or did during the purge that made him decide he needed to remain there personally is not supplied. The nobles who served Annalise, the courtiers, the servants, the extended Cainhurst family are not present in the castle. The castle has their belongings. It has furniture arranged for habitation. It has the architecture of a functioning aristocratic household. The people are gone. Some of them are presumably among the hostile ghosts and castle enemies you encounter on the way to Annalise's throne room. But those enemies are not identified as specific individuals. Their former Cainhurst residents reduced to hostile presence without names or histories. The Cainhurst invitation, the item that lets you access the castle, is one of the game's most intriguing objects. Someone at Iosefka's clinic had it. How it got there, who it originally belonged to, what relationship that person had with Cainhurst. These are questions the game raises by placing the invitation in that specific location and then doesn't answer. The person who possessed the invitation, and who presumably intended to use it, is not in the game world. They had a connection to Cainhurst, they were in the clinic, and they're absent. The Vileblood covenant that Annalise offers you involves the collection of blood dregs from other hunters. The purpose of these dregs, the ritual she's performing, the resurrection she's apparently waiting for, is connected to her bloodline's particular power. But the Vilebloods who previously collected blood dregs for Annalise are not present. Either they were killed in the purge, or they left Cainhurst before the purge, or they're somewhere the game doesn't show you. The previous practitioners of the Vileblood covenant are as missing as the nobles who lived in the castle. The snow around Cainhurst Castle, the perpetual blizzard, the carriages that operate on a route through weather that doesn't seem to exist in the normal Yharnam climate, suggest that the castle exists in a slightly different relationship with the physical world than the rest of the game's locations. This has implications for the missing Cainhurst nobles. If the castle is slightly outside of normal space-time, the people who were in it during the purge might have ended up somewhere that corresponds to neither the castle nor the game's other accessible locations. They could be in the snow. They could be in the space the carriages travel through. They could have stepped outside of the game's geography when the church hunters arrived. Logarius's mask is one of the game's most immediately striking pieces of equipment. The mask suggests not just protection, but concealment, a deliberate choice to hide one's face during the activity that requires the mask. Logarius, sitting on the castle roof, wearing a mask, suggests a person who doesn't want to be seen doing what he's doing. What he's doing, or what he was doing before he became the stone statue of a sentinel you find when you reach him, is watching over Annalise. Or watching to make sure Annalise doesn't leave. Or watching to make sure something in Annalise doesn't escape. All of these readings are possible, and none of them explains where the other church hunters who came to Cainhurst went after the purge, or why Logarius alone felt the need to stay. The relationship between Cainhurst and Yharnam before the purge, the period when the Vile Bloods were a known faction and the castle was a functioning part of Yharnam's social world, is one of the least reconstructible periods in the game's implied history. Item descriptions reference the Vile Bloods as historical actors who had a relationship with the healing church that was not always purely antagonistic. At some point, the relationship became antagonistic enough to warrant a military action. The events of that transition, the specific thing or things that convinced the church that the Cainhurst bloodline needed to be eliminated, are not documented in any item you can find. The Cainhurst armour is among the most elaborate in the game, intricate, expensive, clearly the product of significant craftsmanship. The people who wore it were people of means and status. The game doesn't supply their names or their roles within the Cainhurst hierarchy. A piece of armour as elaborate as the Cainhurst set has a history of owners, a tradition of maintenance and inheritance. That history is gone with the people who wore it. What remains is the object, divorced from the lineage that made it meaningful. The bloodlines of Yharnam, the Cainhurst bloodline most prominently, but also the implied blood dynasties of other aristocratic families in the game, are a specific category of missing that involves not just individual people, but entire genetic lines. A bloodline that is extinguished as a deliberate policy choice removes not just the currently living people, but the potential future people who would have descended from them. The Church's purge of Cainhurst is, in this reading, a double disappearance. The people who existed at the time of the purge and all of their theoretical descendants who now will never exist. There's a reading of Annalise as not actually wanting to be found or helped, as having arranged her isolation deliberately, as having cooperated with some aspect of the Church's action against Cainhurst in order to secure her own continued existence in a form the Church found acceptable. This reading makes her a survivor who negotiated the terms of her survival rather than a victim who escaped the purge. But if that reading is correct, it raises a different kind of missing persons question. Who were the Cainhurst nobles who were sacrificed to make Annalise's survival arrangement possible? Who did she give up? The executioners, the faction associated with Alfred and Logarius, with the explicit purpose of targeting the Vile Bloods, are described in their item descriptions with a pride in their work that the game presents without endorsement. They saw themselves as cleansing agents. The people they cleanse from Cainhurst are not characterised from the executioner's perspective as missing or as losses. They're characterised as removed. The language of the executioner items is the language of institutional satisfaction with completed work. That institutional satisfaction is what makes the actual missing people of Cainhurst so invisible within the game's own in-universe records. The castle's interior spaces, the ballrooms, the libraries, the private quarters, are arranged in a way that suggests interrupted habitation rather than cleared habitation. Things are in place in a way that suggests people expected to return to them. A ballroom that has been properly closed down looks different from a ballroom where the party simply stopped. Cainhurst's interiors look like the latter. The people in those rooms didn't pack their belongings and leave. They stopped, suddenly, and they didn't come back for their things. The things they left behind are the only testimony the game preserves about who they were. The library at Cainhurst, the vast implied library, suggested by the castle's scale and the Vile Blood Queen's evident education, doesn't exist in a recoverable form in the game. The books are not readable. The texts that the Cainhurst nobles wrote, that they collected, that they used to understand their own bloodline and their relationship with the old blood, those texts are gone. They're missing alongside the people who produced and used them. A library whose texts disappear with its owners is a library that has been not just abandoned, but erased. The relationship between the Cainhurst blood, the vile blood, the Queen's specific strain, and the blood healing system is something the game implies was more significant than the Church's official history allows. The vile bloods had something. The Church wanted it gone, or wanted it controlled, or wanted to prevent anyone else from accessing it. The scholars who understood the vile blood's specific properties, who would have been the Cainhurst equivalent of Bergenworth researchers, are among the purges missing. Their knowledge is gone with them, unless some of it was absorbed into the Church's research before the purge made the connection too politically complicated to acknowledge. Alfred's ending, where he completes his mission against Annalise and achieves a kind of release, is one of the game's most pointed commentaries on what the obsession with the Cainhurst purge does to the people who pursue it. Alfred found purpose in the executioner mission. Without it, he has nothing. The Cainhurst nobles he helped erase are not names to him, they're obstacles that have been dealt with. The cost of that framing, the human cost of treating a purge as a task completion rather than as an act with human consequences, is something the game insists you sit with in Alfred's ending, without ever naming the people whose loss he can't and won't consider. There are children implied in Cainhurst, not present, not visible, but implied by the castle's scale and the vile bloodline's interest in continuation. A queen who is explicitly committed to her bloodline would presumably have been concerned with the next generation of that bloodline. Whether children of the Cainhurst line were present during the purge, whether they were treated differently from the adults, whether they were removed in advance or included in the purge's scope, these questions are not addressed by the game. The game's treatment of Cainhurst children mirrors its treatment of Yharnam's children generally. Their existence is implied, and their fate is withheld. The Forbidden Forest doesn't obviously connect to Cainhurst, but certain item descriptions and the game's implied geography suggest that the forest was a space used during the Cainhurst period for particular purposes. If Cainhurst nobles used the forest as a hunting ground, as a route between the castle and Yharnam, as a place for encounters with the old blood's effects, then the forest's transformed state is connected to the Cainhurst bloodline's specific history. Nobles who were in the forest during the relevant period, who were in the forest and not in the castle when the purge happened, might have survived, or might have entered the forest before it became what it currently is, and gotten trapped in whatever the forest became. The carriage that takes you to Cainhurst is a piece of magic that the game doesn't explain. It runs on a summons, it navigates weather that shouldn't exist. The carriages and the people who drove them, the coachmen, the servants who maintained the carriages, the people who lived at the base of the route to Cainhurst, are not in the game world. They disappeared with the household they served. A household's supporting staff and servants are the most overlooked missing persons in any historical purge because they're the least prominent in the record, and Bloodborne is faithful to that historical pattern. The people who made Cainhurst function, the labourers, the craftspeople, the staff, are the most completely erased. Chapter 5. The Nightmare's Unreachable Dead. The hunter's nightmare is, in its most fundamental aspect, a prison. It was constructed to contain something. The knowledge of Kos, the guilt of the hunt, the Great One fetus that was taken from the fishing hamlet, and the people who are in the nightmare are in it either because they were imprisoned as part of that containment or because they were caught in the nightmare's gravitational pull and couldn't escape. The people in the nightmare are, from the perspective of the waking world, missing. They're not dead in any clean sense. They're somewhere. But that somewhere is not accessible to most people, and the people in it can't leave on their own. Simon the Harrowed is the most self-aware inhabitant of the nightmare in the DLC. He came into the nightmare deliberately, looking for answers, and he found that leaving was not straightforward. His presence in the nightmare is a model for understanding how the other nightmare inhabitants got there. They pursued something. Research, power, answers, and they ended up in a place they didn't intend to stay. Simon knows where he is. The question of whether he represents the majority or the minority of nightmare inhabitants, whether most of them know where they are or not, is something the nightmare's atmosphere deliberately leaves unanswered. The Brador prisoner, the church assassin, locked in cells in the nightmare, is one of the game's most constrained figures. He's in the nightmare, in a cell, in his own version of imprisonment within the nightmare's imprisonment. His history is reconstructible through the items associated with him. A church hunter, an assassin, someone who was sent into the nightmare as part of the church's agenda and who ended up trapped in it. The church that sent him is not in the nightmare to explain why he's still there or to authorize his release. He's serving an indefinite sentence in a prison, inside a prison. The fish people of the nightmare, the inhabitants of the fishing hamlet's nightmare analogue, are people the game has transformed beyond recognition, but who were presumably human at some point. Or they are the genuine people of the fishing hamlet, preserved in the nightmare in a form that reflects what was done to them and to the things they were in contact with. Whether they experience their current state, whether there is a subjective experience of being what they have become, is one of the questions the nightmare raises most acutely. They're present. They're active. They react to you. But whether anyone is home in the sense of a continuous personal identity is not clear, which makes their missing person status genuinely complicated. Lady Maria in the Astral Clock Tower is one of the nightmare's most significant presences, and the question of what she's doing there, whether she chose to be there, whether she was placed there, whether the nightmare requires her presence or she requires the nightmare's, is not resolved by the fight itself. The clock tower she inhabits is not a space that appears in the waking world. It's a nightmare construction. Whether Maria built it, or whether the nightmare built it around her, or whether it existed before she arrived and she was directed into it, all of these readings are in play. The clocks in the clock tower are also not explained. Clocks suggest time. The nightmare's relationship with time is not the same as the waking world's. The fishing hamlet in the waking world has its own cluster of missing persons, distinct from the nightmare cluster. The original people of the hamlet, before the healing church arrived, before the research, before whatever happened to Kos, are implied to have been a distinct group with their own relationship to the coast and its particular Great One presence. Those people, the pre-research hamlet community, were transformed rather than exterminated. The transformation was done to them. The people who existed before the transformation are missing in the same way the orphanage children are missing. They've been replaced by something. And what they were replaced by occupies their space without preserving their identity. The Orphan of Kos is one of the game's most visually arresting figures, and the name makes the central concern explicit. The Orphan. Kos is dead, or, in some state, analogous to death. The orphan emerged from Kos's body after death. The orphan is in the nightmare. The people who were present when Kos died, who would know the full story of the orphan's emergence and existence, are in the same category as every other nightmare inhabitant, present but not accessible, located but not locatable from the waking world. The orphan's grief is one of the game's most affecting moments, and it's made more affecting by the fact that the context for it, the full story of what was done to its mother and why, is only partially reconstructible. The Hamlet's secret, the thing the choir was researching, the thing that Gehrman and the other early hunters saw there, is one of the game's most deliberately preserved gaps. The game gives you the aftermath of whatever happened at the Hamlet. It gives you the transformed people, the nightmare, the dead Kos, the orphan. It doesn't give you the event itself. The people who were present at the event, who saw what happened, who participated in it, who watched it and couldn't stop it, are distributed across the nightmare and the game's implied history without enough specificity to reconstruct a complete account. The cave access to the lower areas of the nightmare, the passages that connect the nightmare's village to the coast, is full of evidence of movement. People went through those passages. In which direction and when and why is not specified. The nightmare's geography is compressed and non-linear in ways that make it difficult to reconstruct a sequence of events from the physical evidence. But the people who moved through those caves, who used them as access points between the nightmare's inland area and its coastline, are implied by the use evidence without being identified. The Great Ones themselves are a category of missing persons in the most cosmic possible sense. They're described as having had children, relationships, presences in the human world. Koss's presence at the hamlet, Murgo's existence in the nightmare, the moon presence's relationship with the hunter's dream. These are all Great Ones whose location is known, but whose history, whose origin, whose specific trajectory through whatever existence a Great One leads, is not recoverable. They're missing their backstory. The game gives you what they are now and leaves there what they were as the deepest unsolved case. The pale blood that you're searching for at the game's opening is, in certain readings, not a substance, but a state, a condition of consciousness that the hunt's most successful participants are trying to achieve or have already achieved. If the pale blood is a state rather than a thing, then the hunters who found it, who achieved whatever the pale blood represents, are missing in the specific way of people who found what they were looking for and then stopped existing in the form that was looking. The most successful hunters in Yharnam's history are, in this reading, the most completely missing. They found the answer, and the answer consumed them. The nightmare's architecture, the specific choices in how the hunter's nightmare looks and is organized, suggests a designer. The nightmare was made by something. The way it incorporates elements from multiple periods of Yharnam's history, the research hall, the village, the coast, suggests a collection of spaces assembled according to an organizational logic that isn't immediately obvious. The entity that assembled the nightmare, that organized its spaces and placed its inhabitants, is not present in the nightmare in any obviously personified form. The nightmare's architect is itself a kind of missing person, identifiable through the work, not through any direct presence. Mikolash is the nightmare's most self-aware occupant after Simon, in the sense that he knows what the nightmare is and what it's for, even if his grasp of himself has deteriorated. He's been in the nightmare long enough that his personality has collapsed into a kind of ecstatic madness. The Mikolash who entered the nightmare, the scholar of Mensis, the person who thought using the Mensis ritual was a good idea, is not the Mikolash you encounter. The original Mikolash is missing inside the current one. What he was before the nightmare got to him is reconstructible only in outline. The School of Mensis is the most explicitly active institution in the game, in the sense that its members are apparently still pursuing their goals at the moment the game begins. They're performing the ritual. They're reaching into the nightmare. They're in contact with Murgo. The Mensis scholars who are in the nightmare rather than in the waking world's Mensis compound, the ones who crossed over during the ritual, are in the category of people who went somewhere specific and are still there. Missing from Yharnam's streets, present in the nightmare's architecture, not recoverable. The brain of Mensis, the giant brain that the ritual apparently produced or summoned or called through, is one of the game's most disturbing entities because of what it implies about the scholars who created it. The brain is made of something, whether that something is the scholars themselves, whether the Mensis ritual converted the participating scholars into the brain as a side effect of what they were trying to accomplish, is one of the game's most provocative, unanswered questions. If it is, then the Mensis scholars are not missing in any conventional sense. They're present. They're just not present as individuals anymore. The upper cathedral ward's closed-off spaces, the areas you can only reach after significant progression, contain evidence of what the choir was doing at the peak of its research. The people who conducted that research are not in the spaces. The results of the research are. This is the consistent pattern of Bloodborne's most significant mysteries. The researchers disappear, and the results remain. The methodology that produced the results, the specific choices, the specific procedures, the specific people who made and underwent those choices, is withheld, leaving the outcome as a kind of found object without provenance. The nightmare contains music. Ludwig's boss fight has music that is specifically weighted with grief and recognition. The music of the nightmare is not incidental, it's a presence, a layer of the nightmare's design that carries information about what the nightmare is and what it contains. The composers of that music, in the game's implied world, would be people who understood the nightmare intimately. Musicians who knew the nightmare well enough to set it to sound are either in the nightmare or are people who experienced the nightmare and survived it well enough to compose about it. Neither category is represented in the game's accessible characters. The return from the nightmare, the question of whether and how you can leave it, is something the game treats as technically possible, but practically very difficult. Simon found a way in, but not a reliable way out. The hunters who were pulled into the nightmare before the DLC's events, before Simon's investigation, presumably had even fewer resources for understanding how to leave. A hunter in the nightmare, without knowledge of what the nightmare is, without Simon's research or your player character's outside perspective, would have very limited options. Those hunters, the ones who went into the nightmare early, who were among the first to be caught in its pull, are the nightmare's oldest and most disoriented residents. They're there. They've been there a long time. They stopped being recoverable before anyone in the waking world developed the knowledge to go looking for them. Chapter 6. The Pthumerian Queens and the Blood That Spoke. The Pthumerian civilization predates Yharnam by a period the game doesn't quantify, but implies is significant. They were there before the city. They built the labyrinths. They had a relationship with the Great Ones that the Healing Church spent generations trying to reconstruct imperfectly, using the Pthumerian ruins as their research material. The Pthumerians themselves are gone. Their civilization is absent. The few remnants, the queens in the deepest chalice dungeons, the servants and guards who preserved their functions even after the civilization collapsed, are the trailing edge of a disappearance so complete that the word missing barely covers it. The Pthumerian queens are not dead in any ordinary sense. You fight them. They're active, they're powerful, they're in possession of whatever the Pthumerians understood about the old blood. But they're also clearly not functioning as living people in any way that corresponds to human existence. They're preservation cases. They've been maintained in their positions, in their relationship with the chalice dungeon spaces, for a period of time so long that the concept of their original lives is effectively inaccessible. The people who were those queens before they became what they are in the dungeons are missing from the queens themselves. Yharnam, the Pthumerian, is one of the game's most pointed naming choices. The city of Yharnam is named after a queen. The queen is in the chalice dungeons, in a state that the game describes with careful restraint. She has a child. The child is connected to the Great One lineage. The connection between the queen and the city built above her ruins, whether the city was built in her honour, or built to exploit what she represents, or built in ignorance of what's below it, is not explained by the game. But the queen who gave her name to a city is not in the city. She's in a dungeon below the city, in a condition of suspended existence that the game presents as a mystery without supplying the solution. The chalice dungeons are vast. The chalice dungeon system, the network of underground spaces containing Pthumerian ruins, Healing Church research sites, and naturally occurring labyrinthine spaces, is, in terms of sheer size, the largest portion of the game. Most players don't see most of it. The people the game implies existed in those spaces, the Pthumerian labourers, the Healing Church researchers, the hunters who went into the deepest chalices and didn't report back, are missing from a space so large that missing becomes almost meaningless as a description. They're in there somewhere. The somewhere is effectively infinite. The Great Ones that the Pthumerians interacted with are not the same great ones that the healing church is dealing with in the game's main timeline, or they might be the same ones in different aspects or at different stages of whatever great ones go through over vast periods of time. The Pthumerians' specific Great One relationships are not fully reconstructible from the Chalice dungeon content. What the Pthumerians gave and what they received in exchange for their proximity to the Great Ones, whether they gave people as sacrifices or as subjects, as willing or unwilling participants in the exchange, is one of the Chalice dungeon system's most significant gaps. The Pthumerian Elders, the category of aged, powerful beings encountered in the deeper Chalice dungeons, suggest a population that was old even when the Pthumerian civilization was active. These are not people who aged normally, they're people who were preserved or who aged differently because of their proximity to the old blood, or who existed on a timescale that simply extended beyond what human biology normally allows. The families of those elders, the people who were their contemporaries, their children, their students, the ones who lived and died at a normal pace while the elders continued, are missing from the deep Chalice spaces in a way that feels like deliberate exclusion rather than simple absence. The Blood Echoes mechanic in the regular game has a direct analogue in the Chalice dungeon logic. Blood Echoes are, in certain readings, the residual consciousness or energy of the beings that left them. In the Chalice dungeons, there are vast deposits of this residual consciousness available, which implies a vast quantity of former lives. The Pthumerian civilization's missing population is, in this reading, present in the Chalice dungeons as echoes. They're there. They're not people anymore. They're traces of people, accessible only as energy that serves a mechanical function in the game's economy. Their names and their stories are as gone as the civilization they built. The Ailing Loran Chalice dungeon, one of the optional deep dungeons, contains the remnants of a civilization adjacent to the Pthumerian one. Loran was consumed by a beast scourge, the game implies, before Yharnam's scourge became the primary crisis. The people of Loran, whoever they were, whatever relationship they had with the Pthumerian civilization and with the old blood, are not in the dungeon in any recoverable form. The dungeon has their beasts, their environmental remnants, their burial treasures. It doesn't have their histories. A civilization consumed by beasthood before the one city we know about managed the same crisis is a civilization that disappeared without producing a historical record that any remaining institution cared to preserve. The connection between the Pthumerian queens and the female hunters of the game is one of the most tangled implied relationships in the lore. The queens had specific power connected to the old blood in a way that seems to be partially gender-specific or lineage-specific. The church's interest in the queens is connected to this power. The female figures in the church's upper hierarchy, the choir, the healing apparatus, may have a specific connection to the Pthumerian queens that the game doesn't make fully explicit. If that connection exists, then the missing women in the church's history and the missing women in the Pthumerian history are connected, and their disappearances are part of the same longer pattern of extraction and concealment. The Pthumerians built spaces designed for specific religious or ritual functions. The Chalice dungeon altars, the ceremonial areas, the spaces clearly designed for bodies of specific sizes and in specific positions. These are archaeological evidence of practices that the game doesn't describe. What happened in those spaces, to whom, and what the Pthumerians who built and used them believed they were accomplishing. Those are questions the game raises through the architecture and then refuses to answer. The people who participated in those ceremonies are missing from the ceremonies themselves. The spaces remain, the practitioners don't. There is a reading of the Chalice dungeon system that suggests it was not always underground. Or more precisely, that the underground portion is not the original orientation, that the labyrinths were built downward deliberately, as a way of accessing something the Pthumerians believed was accessible only from below. The people who built downward, the labourers, the engineers, the workers who constructed the deep labyrinths, are in the category of people who went down and didn't come back up, not because they died necessarily, but because what they found at the bottom was compelling enough to keep them there, or because whatever was at the bottom was not interested in letting them leave. The Year's Chalice dungeons, the most cosmically strange of the optional dungeons, feel less like underground spaces and more like spaces that exist adjacent to the normal world rather than below it. The Great Ones encountered in the Year's Chalices are different in character from those encountered elsewhere. More alien, less connected to the biological horror of beasthood. The people who built the Year's spaces, if humans built them, which the game doesn't confirm, were presumably working with an understanding of the Great Ones that was different from either the Pthumerian standard or the Healing Church's approach. Those people are missing from a space that might not be fully physical, which makes the search for them essentially impossible. The Pthumerian descendant boss, one of the deep dungeon's most humanoid adversaries, is a being who is clearly related to the Queens, but clearly not the same as the Queens. There's a generation or multiple generations between the Queens and their descendants. The descendants are what the Queens produced. But the descendants themselves produced nothing, or nothing that survived into the game's accessible history. The Pthumerian line, after the Queens, runs into a void. The people who were Pthumerian in the generations between the Queens and the game's main timeline are simply not in any record. The False Depth dungeons, the dungeons that the Healing Church constructed using Pthumerian architecture as a template, are another category of missing space. The Church built imitations of the Pthumerian labyrinths. The people who worked in those imitations, who conducted research, who lived and worked in church-constructed chalice spaces, are distinct from the Pthumerian missing. They're people who were in the Church's system, using Church methods, in spaces that the Church created. Their disappearances would theoretically be documented by Church records. But Church records, as established throughout this video, are not reliable sources for the fate of the people who went into the Church's systems and didn't come out. The Moon Presence, the ultimate antagonist of the game's main narrative, is implied to have a relationship with the Pthumerian civilization that predates its relationship with Gehrman and the Hunter's Dream. If the Moon Presence has been operating in the area of Yharnam and its underground since the Pthumerian period, then its relationship to the Pthumerian Queens and to the Chalice Dungeon civilization is not a new one. The Pthumerian missing persons cases might be in part the Moon Presence's work. People who were consumed by, or converted by, or absorbed into the Moon Presence's purposes over a much longer span of time than the Church period alone accounts for. The relationship between the Old Blood and the Pthumerian civilization's specific form of spiritual practice is not reconstructible from the game's accessible content. But the Chalice Dungeon items suggest that the Pthumerians didn't use the blood in exactly the way the Church later learned to use it. They had a prior knowledge, a relationship with the source that was more direct. The people who maintain that knowledge, who are the Pthumerian equivalent of high priests or scholars, are missing from the dungeons in a way that suggests they didn't simply die, but were moved or preserved or consumed by whatever they were in relationship with. The Golden Order of the Pthumerian civilization, the hierarchy that maintained the Chalice Dungeon system and kept the Queens in their ceremonial roles, would have had its own bureaucratic structure, its own chain of authority, its own records. All of that is gone, not decayed. Gone. The Chalice Dungeons are remarkably well preserved physically. The organic records of the civilization that used them are completely absent. The deliberate removal of the Pthumerian civilization's written record is itself one of the most significant disappearances in the game, because it's a disappearance that has a perpetrator. Someone removed the records. Whoever removed them had a reason. And the reason, whatever it is also missing. The children of the Pthumerian queens, the offspring of queens who had relationships with the Great Ones, would be among the most significant missing persons in the game's entire history. Half human, half Great One, carrying genetic material that both the Healing Church and the Great Ones themselves would presumably have strong interests in. where those children went, whether they're among the game's extant Great One figures, whether they developed separately, whether they were hunted or adopted or isolated, is a question the game poses through the implication of the Queen's relationships, without supplying any component of the answer. The Thumerian civilization's end, the event or series of events that stopped it from being a functioning civilization and converted it into the archaeological substrate that Yharnam was eventually built on top of, is described in terms that are even vaguer than the game's other significant historical events. Something happened. The civilization ended. The queens survived, in their preserved forms, in their dungeon positions. Everyone else, the population of a civilization that built the underground structures you spend significant portions of the game navigating, is gone. In a population-size sense, this is the single largest missing persons case in Bloodborne. An entire civilization, gone, and the mechanism of their going is the game's deepest withheld information. Chapter 7. The Patients Nobody Came Back For. Every building in Yharnam that is not a church or a workshop is in some essential way a medical facility. The blood healing isn't just a treatment offered at specific locations, it's the organising principle of the city's entire relationship with its population. People come to Yharnam because of the blood. People live in Yharnam because the blood keeps them there, because the blood is working on them in ways that create dependency. Because the architecture of the city is designed to manage the flow of people toward the blood and away from the things the blood produces in them when it stops working. The patients of Yharnam are not simply the sick people who sought treatment. They're the entire population of the city, processed through a system that most of them never fully understood and that was designed with their continued participation in mind rather than their genuine recovery. The intake processes for Yharnam's blood healing are not represented directly in the game, but they're implied by the scale of the infrastructure. Eosefka's clinic is the most visible facility, but the item descriptions and the architecture of central Yharnam suggest that blood healing happened at multiple sites, that there were practitioners beyond the ones named in the game, that the distribution of old blood to the city's population was a logistical operation involving more people than the church's upper hierarchy alone. The people who ran those distribution sites, the lower-level practitioners, the people who administered blood to ordinary Yharnam residents as a routine transaction, are not in the game world. They're not among the transformed enemies. They're not among the friendly NPCs. They are simply not accounted for. The blood healing's dependency mechanism is one of the most significant implied facts in the game. Once you've received the old blood, the implication is that stopping creates withdrawal effects. The people of Yharnam didn't just choose to use the blood healing and then choose to stop using it. They were enrolled in a system that made stopping more dangerous than continuing. The patients who tried to stop, who understood enough about what the blood was doing to them to want to stop, would have been in a specific kind of crisis. The game doesn't show you those people. It shows you the end states of people who continued, who transformed. The people who tried to stop and what happened to them is a gap the game preserves with particular care. There's an implied geography to Yharnam's patient population that the game sketches through the architecture of the districts. Central Yharnam's residents are the most directly affected by the night's events. They're on the streets, in the houses, in the earliest stages of the hunt's worst outcomes. The Cathedral Ward's residents were presumably wealthier, more connected to the church hierarchy, with access to better blood or to better processing of the blood's effects. The difference between what happens to a Central Yharnam patient and what happens to a Cathedral Ward patient, when both were using the same fundamental substance but in different social positions, is something the game implies without detailing. The patients who sought treatment for conditions unrelated to beasthood, who came to Yharnam's medical facilities for ordinary illness, for injury, for the kind of healing that the blood's reputation suggested it could provide even for mundane conditions, are a specific subcategory of the city's missing population. Not everyone who entered the medical system was a potential beast. Some of them were sick people who wanted to be well, Those people, if the blood healing worked as advertised, would have recovered. If it didn't work as advertised, if the treatment involved risks that weren't disclosed, then those people are in the same position as every other missing Yharnam patient. They went into the system and didn't come out as themselves. The blood saint concept, the implied existence of particularly powerful blood donors whose blood was more effective than ordinary old blood, is referenced in certain item descriptions in a way that suggests the Church treated blood sources as a hierarchical resource. Some blood was better than other blood. The people who were identified as particularly valuable blood sources were, in the Church's calculus, more asset than patient. What happened to the people the Church identified as high-value blood donors is not addressed in the game. The Church's interest in preserving a valuable asset would conflict with the Church's research interest in pushing the boundaries of what the old blood could do. The patients who were both valuable and useful as experimental subjects are in a category where the game's silences are particularly weighted. The recovery rooms in Yharnam's implied medical infrastructure, the spaces between intake and whatever comes after, are spaces the game doesn't show you. The transition between a person being a patient and a person being whatever the blood makes them is not documented. Iosefka's clinic shows you the before and the after. The during is locked behind a door you can't get through from the front entrance. The during is what the Church manages with particular care. The during is where the people go. There are patients in the game who are aware of their situation and are trying to manage it. The window can find NPCs, the people speaking to you from inside locked houses, are patients in a specific sense. They know something is wrong with them or with their environment. They've made a choice to isolate, and they're hoping to wait out the crisis. Whether any of them survive the night is not confirmed for most of them. The ones who tell you to go away, who refuse to engage, who shout at you to leave, they're patients in the sense of people who have identified a danger and are managing their exposure to it. Their survival is not guaranteed by that management. The ones who aren't in the game's ending states are missing in the most immediate possible sense. The woman calling for Gascoigne, her voice carrying through the central Yharnam streets, audible to you as a player, is the game's most direct representation of a missing person being actively searched for by someone who doesn't know the outcome yet. She's looking. The person she's looking for is somewhere. She's not going to find him in a state she can recognize as her husband. The gap between her search and the game's established facts is one of the most compact missing persons narratives in the game. She's the searcher. Gascoigne is the missing person. And the truth is something the game withholds from her entirely. The women in the houses who give you items, who pass things through windows, who speak to you with varying degrees of coherence, are patients in a different stage. They've been inside, they've watched the street from their windows for long enough to have things to give you. The history of their isolation, how they decided to stay inside, how long they've been waiting, whether anyone they knew was outside with them at the beginning of the night and is now not outside, is not supplied. They're present as voices, their histories are missing. The connection between the blood healing and the city's architectural choices, the narrow streets, the lantern placement, the elevated walkways that allow patrol without direct engagement, suggests that Yharnam's physical design accounts for the possibility that the population might need to be managed rather than simply served. A city built for blood healing should be open and accessible. Yharnam is neither. It's a city built to control movement, to funnel people, to create choke points. The patients who moved through that city's funnels and choke points, who ended up in the positions the architecture was designed to place them in, are missing in a way that was, to some extent, planned for. The cages in Yharnam, the suspended cages visible in several districts, the cages used to transport people or to contain people in specific locations, suggest a processing system. People in cages are people being moved from one location to another, or being held in a specific location. The game doesn't identify who was in those cages or where they were being moved from and to. The cages are empty when you encounter them, or they contain enemies who can't tell you anything about how they got there. The patients who were in those cages at some earlier point in the night, or in previous nights, are as unidentified as every other element of Yharnam's missing population. The blood dregs, the material that accumulates in the blood of hunters who kill other hunters, are, in certain readings, the residue of the killed hunter's personality or consciousness. If that reading is correct, then the blood healing system, which circulates blood through multiple recipients, is circulating those residues as well. The patients who received blood healing after a specific donation event, who received blood that contained the residue of whoever contributed to it, were receiving something that the church presumably understood and did not disclose. The patients who are missing are partly missing because what they received changed who they were, and the person who received the treatment is not the same person who arrived for it. The healing church's medical evangelism, the implied missionary aspect of blood healing, the suggestion that the church actively promoted and distributed blood healing to populations beyond Yharnam, means that patients from outside the city are part of the missing picture. People who heard about the blood healing's benefits and travelled to Yharnam, who left their home communities to seek treatment, who went to the city and didn't come back, their communities would have noticed. Their families, in whatever towns and villages sent people to Yharnam for treatment, are waiting for people who are not coming back. The game's geography excludes those origin communities, but their existence is implied by the scale of what the church was doing. There's a specific patient category the game hints at in the research hall. People who were treated for what the church described as ordinary illness, but who were actually enrolled in experiments without their knowledge. The research hall patient's transformation, the eye-related cognitive changes they undergo, is presented as the outcome of a research protocol, rather than as a side effect of ordinary treatment. But the patients presumably understood themselves to be receiving care for a condition they had, not as subjects of a transformation experiment. The gap between what they thought they were agreeing to and what was done to them is one of the most fundamental missing person structures in the game. The person who consented to treatment and the person who underwent the experiment are not the same person, and the first one is missing. Chapter 8. The messengers and what they remember the messengers are easy to overlook as a significant element of the game's lore, because they're so thoroughly present, so constant, so embedded in the mechanics of play that they become furniture. They hand you items, they crowd around lanterns, they wear hats. They're cute, in an unsettling way. But the messengers are not decorative. They're the most direct evidence the game offers of a specific kind of missing person. Beings who are human and who have been changed into something that serves the dream's mechanical functions, who retain fragments of their previous existence in the form of behaviour patterns they can't explain. The messengers are described in the game's item descriptions as residents of the dream, who have been there long enough to have lost most of what made them individual. They cluster, they murmur, they reach upward. The reaching upward is one of the most consistent behaviours, and certain readings suggest it's a remnant of something they did when they were human, reaching for something they wanted or reaching towards something they feared. The specific gesture, repeated endlessly by beings that can no longer articulate why they do it, is the game's most condensed image of a missing person. Someone present enough to maintain an action, but absent enough to have lost the reason for it. The question of how messengers are made, where they come from, what they were before they became what they are, is one the game doesn't answer directly. They're in the dream. They've been in the dream. The dream has been running for a long time. The most parsimonious reading is that messengers were once hunters or hunters' dreamed counterparts, people who entered the dream and stayed long enough to be transformed by it into the dream's support function. A hunter who entered the dream and never left, who spent enough cycles in the dream's service, would accumulate dream exposure in a quantity that changes the person irreversibly. The messengers are what that change produces. If messengers were once people, which the item descriptions more than suggest. Then each messenger is a missing person in a form that can hand you blood vials. The individual who became the messenger wearing the top hat was at some point someone with a name and a purpose in Yharnam or in some place connected to Yharnam. The top hat is a retention, something the messenger's behaviour latched onto as meaningful even as the meaning became inaccessible. A person who valued a specific object enough that the object's echo persists in their post-human form is a person whose last clear attachment was to that object. What their other attachments were, what else they valued, who else was in their life, those are gone. The messenger bath, the pool of messengers you can access through the insight transaction, is a community of former people in a state of communal dissolution. They're together. They murmur together, whether there's communication happening between them, whether they share experience or memory in a way that constitutes a kind of collective survival of their individual pasts, is not addressed. A group of former people who are physically proximate, but who have lost the ability to articulate their previous selves, is either the saddest configuration the game presents, or a kind of accidental community formed from shared loss. The game lets you decide which. The messengers who wear items you unlock through the Insight Merchant are particularly interesting as missing persons cases. The items they wear, the hats, the accessories, are objects from the waking world that have found their way into the dream. The mechanism by which waking world objects end up as messenger accessories is not explained. Whether those objects belong to the people who became the messengers, or whether the objects arrived in the dream through some other mechanism and the messengers simply adopted them, is a question the game doesn't close. But the possibility that a messenger is wearing the hat that belonged to it when it was a person is a missing person's detail the game buries in a cosmetic system. The messengers who crowd around the headstones in the dream's cemetery. If the dream has a cemetery, which certain visual readings of the dream's architecture suggest, are messengers in proximity to graves. Whether those graves mark anything, whether they're decorative or functional in the dream's logic, is not established. A grave in the dream would be a grave for someone who died in the dream, which presents obvious conceptual complications since the dream is already a space adjacent to death. But if the dream contains graves, the messengers who cluster around them might be clustering around the graves of people they were connected to before they became messengers. Former hunters who formed attachments to other former hunters, whose post-human forms retain enough of those attachments to produce a gravitational pull toward the grave markers. The way messengers react to the player character, the reaching, the handing of items, the general orientation toward the hunter suggests that they understand what a hunter is. They recognize the function even if they can't articulate the history. A messenger who was once a hunter would understand hunters in a specific way, from inside the category rather than as an observer of it. The civility of the messengers toward the player character might be, in this reading, not the simple deference of a lesser being to a greater one, but the specific deference of a former hunter to a current one, a behavioural remnant of whatever hierarchy governed their lives when they were people. The insight economy, the system where you spend insight to purchase messenger accessories, is a transaction that the game presents as straightforwardly transactional, but which, in the context of the messengers as former people, has a different weight. You're spending the accumulated cognitive cost of witnessing Great One adjacent reality in exchange for decorating the former people who now serve the dream's logistics. The messengers who receive the accessories accept them, put them on, continue their functions, whether the accessory means anything to them, whether putting on a hat triggers anything in a being that was once a person who wore hats, is not addressed. The game's cosmetic economy is also, if you accept the messengers as former people reading, a question about whether objects can give former people back any fragment of what they were. The dead messenger in certain locations, a messenger that is motionless, that has stopped performing its functions, is the game's image of a messenger at the end of whatever lifespan the dream allows. A dead messenger is a former person who went through the complete arc, from person to dream inhabitant to messenger to inert object. The complete arc is the most thorough disappearance the game presents. The person is gone. The messenger is gone. What remains is a small inert form that the game doesn't flag as significant. The most complete missing persons case in the game might be a dead messenger lying unacknowledged in the hunter's dream. Chapter 9. The Graves Without Names. Yharnam has graves. This is easy to establish from the game's environments. The cathedral ward has grave markers. The areas near the Grand Cathedral have burial spaces. The Forbidden Woods, in certain sections, has markers that suggest intentional burial rather than incidental death. The Old Labyrinth has burial arrangements that speak to a civilization that had specific practices around the disposal and commemoration of the dead. All of these graves are present in the game. None of them are readable in any complete sense. The people buried in them are, by definition, among the game's most thoroughly missing. Their location is known. Their remains are presumably present. Their identities are not accessible. The grave markers in the cathedral ward are interesting in their specific placement. They're near the Grand Cathedral, but not in it. They're in the spaces between buildings, in the areas that would have been accessible to the city's general population rather than to the church's inner hierarchy. These are presumably the graves of people who participated in the life of the cathedral district without being part of its power structure. Worshippers, residents, people who lived near the church and who died in proximity to it. Their graves put them in the church's neighbourhood, but not in the church's records. They're the graves of people who were close to the institution without being absorbed by it. The unnamed grave markers, the ones without inscriptions, or with inscriptions, worn away to illegibility, are the most honest representation in the game of what happens to most people's historical identity. The inscribed graves tell you someone thought the buried person was worth marking in a specific way. The blank graves are the default, a marker that says someone was here without committing to who that someone was. Yharnam's blank graves are not anomalies. They're the norm. The inscribed graves are the exception, and even the inscribed graves don't tell you anything the game considers lore relevant. The graves in the Forbidden Woods suggest a different relationship between burial and the landscape than the cathedral ward's organised markers. The woods' graves are scattered in a way that implies individual burials rather than institutional ones. Someone was buried here. One person, by some other person or persons, in this specific location. The why of the location, why this spot, why here, rather than somewhere else, is connected to the wood's broader function as a place where things that didn't fit in Yharnam's official spaces were deposited. A burial in the Forbidden Woods might be a burial that wasn't supposed to happen anywhere else. A person who needed to be buried away from the city's records. The connection between graves and the insight mechanic is one the game suggests, but doesn't develop. Graves are markers of the gap between the living and the dead. The insight mechanic is, in part, about gaining access to a layer of reality not normally visible. The suggestion, supported by certain item descriptions, that graves in Yharnam are not simply markers, but loci of something, that the dead in Yharnam are not as separate from the living as the markers imply, points toward a reading of the Cemetery of the Deep as something other than a simple memorial space. The graves have presence. What exactly is present in them is something the game suggests without committing to. The graves in the Old Labyrinth, the Pthumerian burial arrangements visible in the Chalice dungeon environments, are the oldest graves in the game. They predate the city. They predate the church. They're the burial markers of a civilization that ended before anyone currently alive in Yharnam was born. The Pthumerian graves are the game's most ancient missing persons cases, people so far removed from the game's present that their graves are archaeological objects rather than memorials. No one is mourning them. No one is searching for them. They're past the event horizon of grief, buried so long ago that their absence is simply the state of the world. The difference between a Pthumerian grave and a Yharnam grave is partly a difference in proximity to grief. A fresh grave has someone attached to it, someone who dug it, someone who carried the body, someone who placed the marker. A Pthumerian grave has only the game's archaeology. But both are missing persons cases in the same fundamental sense. A person was here and now is not here, and a marker acknowledges the transition. The age of the marker doesn't change the structure. It changes only who's doing the searching and how much anyone cares about what they find. The graves of hunters specifically, if any of the game's grave markers belong to hunters, would be interesting for the information they would provide about the expected fate of hunters. A culture that buries its hunters rather than losing them to the nightmare or to beasthood, that has enough institutional stability to perform regular burial, is a culture in a different relationship with the hunt than the current one. Whether the pre-nightmare Yharnam had hunter graves, whether there was a period when hunters died in ways that allowed for burial, is a question the game raises through the existence of graves without committing to whether any of them are hunter graves specifically. The grave markers in the dream itself, if such things exist, and the visual architecture of the dream suggests they might, would be the most ontologically strange graves in the game. A grave in the dream is a grave for someone who died in a space that doesn't fully follow physical laws. What does a grave in the dream mark? Where are the remains? If the dream persists independently of the dreamer's physical state, then a grave in the dream persists differently than a grave in the waking world. The graves in the dream, if any, are the game's most permanently sealed cases. The missing persons they mark are missing in a space where missing doesn't resolve into the same options it does in the physical world. Gehrman's garden, the space around the hunter's dream workshop, the trimmed hedges and maintained ground, has the quality of a space that has been cared for by someone for a very long time.